Liability landmines in real estate. They're everywhere for buyers, for sellers, even for realtors. It's a thing to be paying attention to is what is your liability on any transaction in real estate? We're going to talk about that and more in today's episode of The Den.
The Den, powered by the Lyons Group, a show dedicated to exploring hot topics in real estate, local happenings, and industry trends. We're a small team of professionals approaching $400 million in sales and nearly 2,000 local transactions. You're listening to time-tested experts and industry leaders. Here's a refreshing look at real estate happenings and more. Welcome to The Den.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of The Den, where we're going to be talking about liability. Whether you're a buyer or seller or even a realtor, there's liability in transactions in real estate. We're going to talk about some of those forms and what it looks like and explore some options to avoid liability altogether. But before I get to that, let me introduce my friends, my partners, my co-hosts, the fellow members of the Lyons Group. To my left, Paul, Hamby the Rockberry, Aspen the Ninja Gruen, and the boss, Shannon Martin Martinez. My name is Ben Lyons, and I'm the host of The Den, top brokers taking on tough questions. So today, liability in real estate, that's the big conversation because believe it or not, people think that sellers are the ones that take on liability. There can be buyers that take on liability as well. If they do something wrong, they do something that's unethical throughout the process, there is liability all the way around. Let's not even forget about the realtors that are involved because that can be ugly as well if we're crossing lines. So let's talk about liability today. Some of the hot spots for getting yourself in trouble and then how to avoid it. So Aspen, I'm going to kick it off with you. As a buyer, this is a tricky one.
Unfazed.
I know.
You see that? We're always going, no.
Yeah. As a buyer in a transaction, what could be some of the liability that you would face?
You do still have to get things done by certain timelines. So, you have your basic contingencies for inspections, appraisal. You have, you still have to get all your loan. You have to get your lender all your loan documents that you need. And you also could be sued for specific performance. So if you back out of the contract at the very end for no reason and you're past all contingencies, the seller can sue you for specific performance to kind of force you to buy that house.
Yeah, now that's an uphill battle.
That's an extreme situation, but it could happen.
And it has happened in the past, absolutely. It is an uphill battle to get a buyer to sue for performance from a buyer. It's less of a battle to sue for performance with a seller because the sellers, for whatever reason, once they sign that contract, they're a little more obligated in the court's eyes than a buyer, right? But that's a fair point. So let's talk about other forms of liability for a buyer. Do you think a buyer could be liable if they actually have to sell a home before they buy a home and they don't disclose that?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I think that's called fraud.
Yeah.
That's the legal term for
That's
that.
the legal term. So yeah. We're not much for legal jargon here in the Den, but yeah. So if they do something fraudulent in that, I mean, what are some of the other instances you could think of where a buyer really should have put some more cards on the table and they felt like maybe it was marginalizing their ability to negotiate and we're standing back and going, no, that's fraudulent. So can you think of any other examples there?
I think that would be kind of one of the more extreme ones. If you had to sell anything before putting an offer on the property and maybe it was already under contract and you're like, oh, it's definitely going to close, so I'm just not going to put it on there. That is not only fraud, it's very unethical because you're not allowing everyone to make an informed decision on what they would like. So I think it'd be better if you just say, you know what, we're under contract on the property, we're closing on this date. We're through this, and this, and it's looking really, really good, but just want to let you know. I think that would probably be one of the extreme cases because let's say you don't have the funds or you spend your down payment money, your lender is going to catch that and you're just not going to be able to buy the house at that point. But if you're actually intentionally hiding something, I think that would be a much bigger red flag than accidentally spending your down payment money on something.
Yeah, exactly.
Buying a car during the process because maybe your realtor let you know or maybe they didn't know and you bought a car and now you can't get the loan. Very frustrating because I'm sure people have told you that you can't do that, but maybe you just, honest mistake, forgot. And
so there's a difference between being fraudulent, just outright fraudulent, and negligence to some degree. Like negligence is, I went and bought a car, I didn't really think it through. I was negligent on thinking through the whole process, but now here we are, I can't buy your home. And there's some serious repercussions that could carry down the line to the seller. The seller's like, wait a minute, I moved out and I put offer on another property. And
I've seen people too where they know that they can't purchase a car, but they got approved for $250,000 and they're only buying the house for $220,000. So what's that $30,000 difference? It makes a difference. It makes a really big difference. But I think sometimes it's more just not being educated in the process than actually being unethical and hiding things.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And for our viewers to understand, we are, as realtors, required to disclose any adverse material facts. And oftentimes people associate that with just the seller. Like, hey, I've had mold in my crawl space. I need to disclose that. Yes, that's an adverse material fact. However, there is the flip side with the buyers. I have to sell this property before buying yours. That is an adverse material fact. An adverse material fact is defined as something that would influence a buyer or seller's decision to accept a contract. And if it would influence their decision to buy or sell, then that needs to be disclosed. So it's pretty plain, pretty matter of fact. Shannon, do you want to parlay on that in regard to buyers? Any other liability that buyers may take on for inadvertent things that they do or very specific things that they do?
Yeah, I think that you have the contractual obligation. You have to follow through with what you've agreed to in the contract, obviously. But I think a lot of times what people don't think about is when you're dealing with your lender, you're dealing with, there's a lot of regulation behind all that. There's a lot of things that are going to be required of you, and honesty is one. And sometimes some of the pitfalls that buyers fall into is they don't fully disclose maybe to their lender some things. And, you know, loan fraud is regulated very heavily. So I think sometimes people take that for granted. They don't really know what they're getting themselves into. You know, you need to be very transparent. You could really open yourself up to liability. Understand that your lender's probably going to find out everything anyway, so there's really no reason in holding anything back or hiding it. But I think that's one of the places that buyers can really get themselves in trouble. You can get yourself in trouble contractually with your seller by not performing, obviously, and not following through. Maybe it costs you more money if you don't hit a deadline, things like that. But I think where they can really, really open themselves up for liability is not being really honest with their lender. I think that once you've crossed that line, when you think, oh, well, you know, I make this much instead of this much, or they don't disclose that they maybe pay child support. Well, it's not legally. I just pay it to her every month and I have for 6 years. Okay. Then it's your obligation. Yeah. You know, there are a lot of things that I think buyers don't really think about when they're filling out those loan documents, but there are repercussions to them. Yeah. You have to be very transparent.
You have to be super transparent because we've had situations where buyers have changed jobs in the middle of a transaction. And maybe they went from something in the medical field or healthcare field to oil and gas. And it's not the same industry. And so the lender cannot treat the income the same because you don't have a track record there. So there's some gaps there. And the lender may have said, hey, we've got a problem here. And the buyer's like, no, I'll just go to a different lender. And so what happens is you get this trickle down effect, right? So these things start falling and this lender goes by the wayside because they can't help them. And the buyer's scrambling to get a new lender. The buyer's broker or buyer's realtor doesn't disclose to the other side that this is going on. Now all of a sudden you have liability with the buyer and the buyer's realtor because the seller has moved out. They've taken this offer. They've put money down on something else. It's caused them harm. Paul, speak to that a little bit. As far as a realtor is concerned, where is your line in your mind when you need to go, oh, wait a minute. We got to disclose this to the other side. There's a hard ball with a curve.
I'm thinking of two things. We have the two duties to disclose all adverse material fact, and then we have the duty for confidentiality. And the confidentiality thing is any lawful order, right? So we can't break the law. We can't break our ethical guidelines that we work in. So if somebody says, I quit my job, but don't tell anybody because I'm starting a new job right away. We obviously can't do that. So I think for me, I decided a long time ago, and our broker before moving over here to RE/MAX, when I first started, drilled into our heads, avoid liability. Everything you say can be used against you later on. So make sure that you're being truthful, honest. Make sure that when you give somebody information, you're not the source of information, but you're the source of information. So for me, a long time ago, it was just be truthful in all things. And then I'm not the expert in anything, so I'm going to direct you to an expert.
Yeah. So the source of the source. So in your mind, if someone says, hey, let's not tell the other side about that, I'm assuming that's an immediate red flag.
Yeah.
Hey, we don't need to discuss this part.
There's no, I don't think there's any point where you just go, yeah, okay, you're right. I won't tell them.
Yeah.
I think at any time somebody says that, I go, let's discuss this.
I think that's always the baseline. If you have to question whether it should be disclosed, or if you have to say, don't tell the other side, that's when you know it should be disclosed.
Yeah.
Because that is obviously subject matter that would make a difference in the way someone proceeded. And that should always be disclosed.
Yeah, because as soon as I always think that as soon as we don't tell the other side something material, they're spending money that they may not have otherwise spent. Mm-hmm. So I think that we are, we're supposed to be the referees to make sure that those things don't happen.
Yeah, that we are guiding the game in the right way, in the right manner, and in a truthful and honest and forthright manner. I think it's really important. Aspen, when you have a situation where someone says, we don't need to talk about this with the other side, I'm assuming that's a red flag for you as well. But what do you do? And how do you handle a conversation like that with your buyer?
I'm just a pretty blunt person. So there's things that I'm not going to tell. I'm not going to tell any of your private information. I'm not going to say anything personally. If you are getting divorced, or maybe you don't even want your neighbors to know you're selling the house, so you're selling it privately, that all is completely fine. Mm-hmm. If you're trying not to disclose something about the house, like maybe we walked around and I can tell there was a leak right there, and I'm not an expert and I can see that there was a leak there, and we're filling out the adverse material fact page, and I say, were there any leaks on the property? And you go, no. I'm going to say right then and there, okay, well, what about that one? And they're like, oh, but it was repaired. I'm like, okay, well, we still need to disclose it. And if you don't disclose it, I do have to. So I just tell them up front. It needs to be. Yeah. And I also do the whole, disclaimer, disclosure at the very beginning whenever we're filling this out is if anything's been wrong with the house, if you've ever done an insurance claim, if you have anything, just be upfront, because actually buyers really like that. Oh, yes, this was wrong, but we fixed it. Mm-hmm. I think that looks a lot better than just a blank, property disclosure sheet with nothing on it. I think that makes buyers say, you've lived here, or you've owned this for 20 years and you don't know
anything about
it. Never done anything here.
Well, and then there's
a red flag.
The buyers are never asking, what else is the seller hiding from us? Mm-hmm. Because they can see leaks too.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. So that's where you stare at someone and say, don't look up, don't look up.
Yeah.
So has there been any leaks on the property?
None that I know of.
Not that I know of, no.
I do the walkthrough with them too before we do anything, and I say, what's that? What's that? Did you do this? Has this happened? I just ask questions, and then whenever we're filling out that form and they go, no, I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
But you already told me.
Yes, that's right. That's right. See, as realtors and as we become further and further and seasoned in our careers, we start to understand the games a little bit more. And sometimes we do have to work it out of a seller specifically, because not only for our sake, reliability's sake on our side, but for their sake. Like, you don't want to take on liability down the road. And I always see us as a team. Like, look, I don't want to be in this basket with you if you're not being forthright and upfront with me, because I'm doing everything I can to shield us from liability. I would rather hit these things transparent and right up front and have these conversations and have written record of it. Mm-hmm. Because that's really important, because gosh, you sleep one or two nights and you forgot what you said to who. And in a court of law, 2 years later, that doesn't fly. So what are your thoughts, Shannon, on when you're talking with an owner and they say, well, that's been taken care of, we don't need to talk about that. How does your conversation go? I mean, is it case by case? Is it something small?
No, I think that if there's something significant there, whether they think it's important or not, it does need to be talked about. It does need to be put down in writing. It needs to be told to the buyer, because it probably isn't a big deal. But that's for the buyer to decide. That's not for the seller to decide. And that's not for us to decide if it's going to be important to a buyer or not. That's not for us to decide. I think another thing that sellers don't think about a lot when they talk about liability is not just being honest with your property, but, maybe a lot of us are handy. We do a lot of stuff around our house too. So I'm not criticizing this, but there's a lot of times where, maybe the buyer needs a little electrical work done and the seller says, I can just replace all those GFCI. Okay. And maybe he can't. And it's probably not a big deal. Buyer agrees, seller agrees, not a problem. But consider, to lower your liability, would it be that bad to spend $300 on an electrician to come over, have a professional do it, have the documentation, walk out of that house, and if that socket pops and burns up in a week, it wasn't because of you. It wasn't your problem. And sometimes sellers want to limit their expenses so much they forget about the liability aspect. Yeah. You're selling a very large product. Expect that you might have to get a few professionals involved. You might have to get that electrician, or you might have to get a roofer. You can't do everything on your own. Even if you can do it, would you want your liability covered? Would you want to shift that liability to someone else, I should say?
Yes.
Because I would much prefer a roofer go up and fix that little leak than say, you know what, my husband put a little bit of tar on it. It's all good. And 2 weeks later, we have a big storm and the roof falls in on that side and they're coming back after me because we didn't fix it properly. Well, we weren't equipped to fix it in the first place.
Yeah.
You know, but we thought we could do it. And even if you have good intentions, I'm just saying a lot of times people don't consider shifting that liability to someone else. The cost a lot of times is worth it.
Yeah. That's a very fair point. We have an instance right now we're dealing with that, we actually had a home on a crawl space and a termite inspector went out and found 2 boards in the dirt that was holding up a PVC pipe. And he pulled it over and he said, look, there was evidence of termites in these boards at some point. It may have been 10, 15 years ago. It may have been yesterday. We don't know. But there are no other termites on the exterior of the property. I can't see any other evidence of termites. And that deal fell apart. Now, the question is raised now, do you go ahead and remove the boards and have a new termite inspection done? And we talked about this, right? And then you get a clean bill of health, right? So we're going to go in this particular instance, we're going to have the boards removed, have a new termite inspector go out and do the termite inspection. However, here's the caveat. I told my seller I am disclosing the previous report that was just done. Absolutely. Just because they are not in the house, we did get a positive termite report just a few weeks ago. And we have to make that information available because to your point, Shannon, when we were talking about this was, well, yeah, they may not be in that board, but they were near the house at some point, right? And a buyer that would be an adverse material fact. So I think hitting that right up front versus not saying anything and the guy hires that previous company to come out and spray for bugs and they say, oh, by the way, did you know you had a positive and you never treated your house? Right. Right. That would be information that would affect me as a buyer. I would want to know that information. So that's really the acid test, right? Is it something that you would personally want to know? And if you're having to question that, then go ahead and disclose. What are some of the things you've seen, Aspen, over the years where people tried not to disclose and you had to call them out on it? Or do you have any examples or stories you can share with us?
I work with a lot of investors and it just drives me absolutely crazy whenever they've flipped a house and they say, nope, don't know anything about the house. I've never lived in it. I can tell you from personal experience, I've lived in my house and known less about it than whenever I flip a house. That's right. You know more. And I could see maybe if there was a tenant in there for 10 years and they really didn't ask for repairs and nothing was done, maybe, okay, you still might know something. But if you flipped that house, you're telling me you didn't find anything, you didn't do anything. Right. No way. No way. And I have to say I don't really like our new disclosure forms in New Mexico. I wish we would revert back to the old ones that were similar to the ones we use in Colorado because I feel like the questions on ours right now are a little bit too vague or they kind of just, it's not very specific like, well, what is this material or what's this? And I liked that more. I think now they're kind of just like, has there ever been this issue? Is there an issue with this now? And it can get a little bit confusing or convoluted for people.
Yeah. And so parlaying off that a bit, what are your thoughts, Aspen or Paul, on this one? Let's say there was a roof leak in the past, a couple years ago. It was remedied. There was a little bit of mold. It was taken care of. Is that something that you need to disclose or is that something that, hey, it's been taken care of and it's been a couple of years? What are your thoughts there?
It could lead to other problems down the road. So I think, if you do an insurance claim or if a buyer comes in, buys a house, seller didn't disclose that, they have another issue somewhere else. They come back and there's evidence of treatment or evidence of a repair over here. They can deny that claim because it was never disclosed. You know what I mean? You knew about this because there's all this evidence over here of the repair. So I think even if it was repaired 10 years ago, it's best just to put everything down, let the buyer and their insurance company, their contractors, whoever it is, deal with it once they get in the house.
And I think buyers are a lot more forgiving than we give them credit for. Sellers sometimes want to hide things because they think it's going to hinder a sale. But the truth is I think buyers understand that, if the house has been there for 30 years, at some point they've had a leak. At some point they've had an electrical problem. At some point they've had flooding in the yard. At some point they've had something happen to that house. And they understand that. And as long as it's been cared for along the way, they feel better about that, knowing.
Yeah. And a lot of sellers say, I've done the repair. It's good now. And to a certain degree, yes. I understand that argument, but also how long has it been, right? So we just had one up in Morningstar where the back patio settled, and it was because their water wasn't being diverted away. So we had a structural engineer go out, and we got a report, and they said, you need to install a French drain. The seller fixed the concrete, patched it up, put in a French drain, and said, it's good. We don't need to talk about this anymore. And I said, whoa, wait a minute. It's good for the last 5 days.
Have we had rain yet?
We haven't had rain yet. Like, we need to disclose this to a buyer because they may be totally good with it based on the report and the repairs done. But if you don't say anything and then a year from now this happens and they start, exploring what's going on, you're going to be on the hook and I'm going to be on the hook, and I don't want to be on the same hook. So let's make that extra disclosure. So I think at a certain point too, if you did do a repair and it's been enough years and they did do a report and everything came back clean, then are you off the hook for disclosing that if it's been 5 or 10 years? Because we do run into that quite a bit. It's been repaired and we haven't had any issues since. So do you take that extra step and disclose? Paul, you were just about to say something.
When you brought up this topic, my first thing was liability on like irrigation, easements, those types of things. Because what we find a lot of times is, this has irrigation per the seller. And then if it's incorrect or you can't, or, the covenants say such and such and we don't do our due diligence and somebody's incorrect when they give information out like that, the liability, you have a good story about that out on La Plata that, all of a sudden somebody's on the hook to fix this, to remedy this situation. So when we give out information, whether it be on if horses are allowed, if animals are allowed, when we put that out in our advertising, we are taking on huge liability if we're incorrect. Mm-hmm. So anytime anything is put out there, you have to have it verified. That's why I've never put per seller anywhere. If we have irrigation, I have documentation, or I don't put it on there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
It's a great point. What about some other areas of liability on buyer, seller, or realtor side? What are some thoughts there? Aspen, we've dealt with enough deals. We know that, realtors can make misstatements. There can be negligence, but there can also be intentional statements that are made that are untrue. How much is the realtor on the hook if they're not being forthright with information? I
would actually go to say that the realtor is more on the hook than the seller would be. I think if you say something, you're expected as a professional that's doing this day after day after day to have some kind of documentation about it. And not only you, your brokerage is just as responsible as well. So it always surprises me whenever there's brokerages that are overseeing hundreds or thousands of people. There's no way you're checking over the documents as a brokerage. That seems like a lot of liability to me, but maybe that's just me being overly cautious. But I think realtors are more on the hook than a seller.
Yeah, because they're ultimately, I think the buck stops with the realtor because we are the experts and we are charged with navigating this process and making sure our people are truthful and forthright.
And we have the big insurance.
Yeah, we do have the big insurance. So when the lawsuits do come out.
Everybody.
Yeah.
I had a weird one where I was representing a buyer and they were actually just looking at a house. They hadn't put an offer in or anything, but this house was leading. Like, it was off kilter in multiple areas. And I called the listing broker and I said, hey, is there any foundation issues with this property or any structural issues that you know about? They want to put in an offer. And she goes, I don't know why everyone is asking me that. There's nothing wrong with the foundation or the structure of the house. And that to me was just red flag because why are you representing this? You don't know. And I had asked her, is there been a structural engineer out here? No, there's nothing wrong with the house. And this house is off kilter. There's something wrong with it. If I can tell that there's something going on, there's probably something going on.
And it's never
put a pen on it and it would just roll down.
Yeah. Right. And it's never up to us to say, there's nothing wrong here. Everything's good here.
Yeah. And I wasn't the first person called. Why is everybody calling me?
We are not structural engineers. We are not water engineers. We're not electricians. We have to give that back to the professionals.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well,
never for us to say.
One thing about liability too is that we haven't talked about yet is the survivability clause in the contract that says if people go out to do work, somebody's paying those bills. So if you're a buyer and you terminate, that's not part of the contract. You could be on the hook for paying the bills of what the seller had to have come out and get repaired. Liability doesn't stop when the contract ends either.
Or even when the statute of limitations, it's not 7 years after you sold the house. It's 7 years from discovery or whatever, what different times for different states. But it's not from oof.
Yeah.
Passed it. That's not how
We're
it
closed.
works.
It's
We
over.
made it.
Yeah. Closed and wipe your hands of it. That's not how it works.
Yeah. Well, and all great points. I mean, we could really talk for a few more hours about liability, but we're going to have to wrap it up. I'm going to go to a speed round real quick. What do you think is the biggest liability, either the buyer, the seller, or the realtor? What is the biggest action that they could take that would create the most liability? Paul.
Anything fraudulent. If
So
they're not,
intentional fraud.
Intentional fraud. Yeah. I'll stick with that.
All right.
Not a lawyer.
Aspen.
Yeah, fraud and misrepresentation. I mean, our E&O doesn't even cover it because that's just,
Yeah. That's on you.
that's on you.
Yeah.
That's the biggest.
Yeah, I agree. Dishonesty in any way. Just be transparent.
Yeah. And I think you made a good point, Shannon, and I would echo all of that is honesty, being forthright. Your point was buyers are oftentimes a lot less critical than we're thinking that this is going to be a major issue when it may not be an issue at all for them. So disclose. If you're even questioning it, disclose it, because you never know. The other side may just be like, it's not a big deal for us. We still want the home or the property, but you've covered your base. So be honest and forthright in all of your dealings and try to avoid as much liability as possible. We can never truly avoid 100% of liability because you're involved in a transaction and things happen, and that's okay. But you want to be able to get on a stand if you ever had to have that conversation, a hard conversation, be honest and forthright with what your actions were and have no questions about your intentions. So thank you for that great discussion. Moving right along to the Lyons Pride section. As fellow members of the Lyons Group, we like to give back to our community in special and unique ways. And we dedicate a lot of hours in our lives, our personal lives, to make our communities better. And we like to highlight individuals, organizations, or events that do the same thing in the area that make our community better. And it's my turn this week, which I'm really excited for. I want to highlight F.A.S.T, the single track, Farmington Area Single Track for bicycles, not motorized, little bikes that you use your legs with, right? You got to get out there and pump a little bit. And stop it, Paul. But yes,
Just get through with it.
I know. I just want to say thank you to F.A.S.T, and actually a former client of mine, Mike Brown, is very integral in that. I want to highlight that organization. They've done a lot of great things with creating tracks. The new pump track by San Juan Community College. They raffle off a bike every year. It's a 501c3, so it's a nonprofit, but they really go out there and they want our kids and our families to go out and enjoy these bike trails that we have an abundance of in this area. And so if you're part of F.A.S.T, I just want to say thank you for doing what you do. Thank you for leaning into our community. Thank you for providing this outlet for our children. It's wonderful, and we love that our families can get out there and enjoy the work that you've been putting in. So F.A.S.T, thank you so much, and welcome to the Lyons Pride. So next episode is going to be a fun one. We're going to challenge ourselves on old test questions from when we actually got into real estate. Oh my gosh, I'm so nervous. This is going to be terrible.
I could never pass it.
It's going to be fun. It's going to be fun. We haven't prepped, so it's going to be a good one. So you want to stay tuned to that. But if you have any topics you want us to explore or talk about, please comment and reach out to us. We love engagement with our viewers. Go ahead and like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, and just get in the vein with us because we're always putting out content that are helpful for you. Schedule a consultation with any one of the Lyons Group members because we want to give you an advantage in any market and especially today's market. So thank you for staying tuned to this episode, and we'll see you again in the Den.
Thank you for listening to The Den, powered by the Lyons Group. Hit the subscribe button to keep informed on real estate happenings. If you'd like to learn more about the Lyons Group, visit sjcbroker.com. Complex markets require complex strategies. The Lyons Group can give you a true advantage in any market. Whether you're buying or selling, residential or commercial, contact us directly at sjcbroker.com. We're time-tested experts with a client-first approach, and we'll see you next time in the Den.